The airplane wheels touched down, and my heart soared with them. After 3,000 miles and a sleepless night of anticipation, I was finally here for my son's wedding. My fingers smoothed the wrinkles from my best dress, the navy blue one I'd saved for special occasions, and I clutched my small purse tighter, feeling the weight of the gift inside. 27 years I'd raised him. 27 years of scraped knees I kissed, homework I helped with, dreams I nurtured. Today, I thought, would be the pinnacle of it all. The venue was breathtaking. White roses cascaded down marble pillars and golden light filtered through crystal chandeliers. Guests in designer suits and flowing gowns moved like elegant dancers across polished floors. I stood at the entrance, searching for my place in this beautiful chaos, my heart swelling with pride. This was my son's day. This was our moment. "Excuse me, ma'am." A young woman in a black uniform approached me, her smile polite but distant. "Are you with the catering staff?" "Oh, no, dear, I'm the groom's mother." The words felt like honey on my tongue. The groom's mother. How proud they sounded. Her expression shifted, confusion flickering across her features. She glanced at her clipboard, then back at me. Let me check with someone." Minutes passed. Guests filed past me, their laughter and chatter creating a symphony of joy I longed to join. I watched through the doorway as they took their seats, beautiful chairs draped in ivory silk, each one marking someone's importance in my son's life. Reserved signs marked the front rows, family of the groom, wedding party, special guests. The same uniformed woman returned, this time with a folding chair. A simple metal folding chair, she said, positioning it outside the main hall, near a service station where waiters rushed back and forth with silver trays. I stared at the chair, then at the magnificent ceremony space beyond, then back at the chair. "I think there's been a mistake," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the clatter of serving spoons and champagne glasses. "This is where you're assigned, ma'am." The word "assigned" hit me like a physical blow. Assigned! Like a task, like an afterthought. I sat down slowly, the metal cold beneath me, and watched my son's wedding through a doorway. He stood at the altar, handsome in his tailored tuxedo, the same boy I'd rocked to sleep when nightmares plagued him, the same child who'd clung to my hand on his first day of school. He turned slightly, his eyes scanning the crowd, and for one desperate moment, I thought he was looking for me. Our eyes met across the distance. He looked away. A single rose from a nearby centerpiece had fallen to the floor beside my chair. Its petals were still perfect, still fragrant, but it lay forgotten, trampled by rushing feet. I picked it up gently, cradling it in my palm like a wounded bird. The bride entered, radiant and glowing, and the ceremony began. Vows were exchanged about love, honor, and family, about being there for each other always, about never abandoning those we cherish most. I sat outside, holding a fallen rose, watching my son promise to never do to his bride what he was doing to me at that very moment. But that was only the beginning of an awakening I never saw coming.
The hotel room was suffocatingly quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my wedding dress, staring at my reflection in the dark television screen. The woman looking back at me seemed smaller somehow, diminished, as if the evening had physically shrunk her. My fingers found the silk scarf draped over the chair, the same periwinkle blue scarf I'd worn to every milestone in my son's life. His high school graduation, his college acceptance, his first job interview. I'd always believed it brought us luck, this little piece of fabric that connected his victories to my presence. Tonight, it felt like a relic from someone else's life. I closed my eyes, and the memories came flooding back like photographs scattered by wind. There I was, 23 years old, standing over a sewing machine at midnight, stitching the Superman costume he needed for the school play. My fingers were bleeding from needle pricks, but his smile the next morning made every drop worth it. There I was again, working double shifts at the diner, my feet swollen and aching, saving every tip for his college fund. Customers would leave their tables messy, their children screaming, and I'd smile through it all because every dollar meant his future was one step closer. I remembered the Christmas I skipped meals for a week to buy him the bicycle he'd circled in the catalog. How his face lit up like the tree when he found it Christmas morning. How he'd hugged me so tight I thought my ribs might crack, whispering, "You're the best mom in the world." When had I stopped being the best mom in the world? When had I become the woman assigned a folding chair outside her son's wedding? The scarf slipped through my fingers like water, pooling in my lap. I picked it up again, studying its frayed edges, the small stain near the corner from the time he'd spilled grape juice on it during his graduation party. I'd never had it cleaned. I'd wanted to keep that piece of him with me. Now it felt like evidence of my own foolishness. The room grew darker as night settled in, but I didn't turn on the lights. In the darkness, I could see more clearly somehow. I could see the pattern that had been building for years, the missed calls that went unreturned, the holiday invitations that never came, the grandchildren I'd never met who lived just 2 states away. I had been disappearing from his life inch by inch, and I'd been too busy loving him to notice. A single tear traced down my cheek, but it wasn't the helpless crying of earlier. This tear felt different, sharper. It carried with it not just sorrow, but something else, something that tasted like metal and felt like electricity. I stood up slowly, my bones creaking like old floorboards, and walked to the small desk by the window. In the drawer, I found hotel stationery and a pen. My hand trembled as I began to write, not a letter, but a list, an accounting of sorts. 27 years of sacrifice, 27 years of love, and what did I have to show for it? A folding chair and a fallen rose. I set the pen down and stared at what I'd written. Numbers and dates and memories that added up to a life spent in service to someone who had forgotten I existed. But as I sat there in that dim hotel room, something crystallized inside me, a realization sharp as winter air. I was still here, still breathing, still thinking, still capable of more than being discarded. I thought the humiliation was over, but I was about to discover that sometimes the deepest wounds become the most powerful weapons.
The leather notebook felt substantial in my hands. Not like the flimsy hotel stationery, but real, permanent, important. I'd bought it from the gift shop downstairs along with a proper pen, the kind that wouldn't skip or fade. If I was going to plan the rest of my life, I needed tools that wouldn't fail me. I sat cross-legged on the hotel bed, my periwinkle scarf draped around my shoulders like armor, and opened to the first crisp page. At the top, I wrote, "What they don't know." My handwriting was steadier than I'd expected. Years of waitressing had given me quick, efficient penmanship, and now those skills served a different purpose. I began to list everything: bank account numbers, property deeds, investment portfolios that my son assumed he understood but had never bothered to ask about. The beach house in Delaware that his father and I had bought 40 years ago? He'd always talked about it like it would be his someday. But the deed bore only my name. The retirement account I'd built working 3 jobs while he was in college. Untouchable and substantial. The life insurance policy that named him as beneficiary, contingent on certain conditions he'd never read the fine print to discover. I paused, pen hovering over paper, remembering the conversation we'd had last Christmas. He'd been talking about his financial plans, his investments, his future, and then, almost as an afterthought, he'd mentioned me. "Don't worry, Mom. We'll figure something out for you when the time comes. Maybe a nice facility." A nice facility. Like I was a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be loved. I wrote that down too, along with the date and the dismissive tone he'd used. Evidence, documentation, the beginning of understanding just how calculated his neglect had become. My phone buzzed. A text from him. "Thanks for coming to the wedding. Sorry it was so hectic. Hope you had fun." Fun. I stared at the word until it lost all meaning. Then I turned my phone face down and kept writing. Page after page, I documented everything. The promises he'd made and broken, the times I bailed him out financially when he was younger, the inheritance from his grandmother that I'd given him early, trusting that love and generosity would be remembered and reciprocated. But this wasn't just about money. This was about dignity. This was a woman who had spent decades building a legacy, only to watch her own son try to write her out of the story. I flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "The reception." Tomorrow night was the wedding reception, another celebration I'd be expected to attend, another opportunity for him to showcase his new life while keeping me in the shadows. But what if I didn't stay in the shadows this time? What if the woman who'd spent 27 years making sure her sun shined finally decided to let her own light burn bright? I thought about the guests who would be there, family members who remembered me, friends who'd watched me raise my son single-handedly after his father died, people who knew the real story, even if they'd been too polite to mention the empty chair at the ceremony. My pen moved across the page, outlining not a confrontation, but a revelation. Truth spoken clearly and without anger. Facts presented with the same precision I'd once used to balance checkbooks and plan birthday parties and organize every detail of a life lived in service to others. The notebook was nearly half full when I finally set the pen aside. Outside the window, dawn was breaking over the city where my son lived his new life, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. Quiet, steady, unshakable power. I stood and walked to the mirror, studying my reflection in the morning light. The woman looking back at me wasn't diminished anymore. She was focused, determined, ready to reclaim her place in a story that had always been as much hers as his. I picked up my scarf, the faithful periwinkle companion of every milestone, and draped it around my neck. But this time, it didn't feel like a good luck charm. It felt like a battle flag. Little did I know, the storm I was preparing was about to break sooner than I imagined. And when it did, it would change everything. The reception hall glittered like a jewel box, all crystal and gold and the kind of orchestrated perfection that costs more than most people make in a year. I stood in the doorway, no longer the forgotten woman in the folding chair. Tonight, I wore my dignity like evening wear. The periwinkle scarf was draped elegantly around my shoulders, and my notebook, my weapon of truth, was tucked discreetly in my purse. Guests swirled around tables laden with orchids and champagne, their laughter creating a soundtrack of celebration that felt as hollow as it was beautiful. My son stood near the head table, resplendent in his tuxedo, his arm around his bride as they accepted congratulations and well wishes. He was in his element here, the center of attention, the successful man who'd built himself up from nothing. Except that wasn't quite true, was it? I walked deeper into the reception and conversations quieted as people noticed me. Aunt Margaret, who'd helped me through those first terrible months after my husband's death. Cousin Robert, who remembered the woman who'd worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Mrs. Henderson from down the street, who'd watched me walk my son to school every morning for 6 years because I couldn't afford a car. They remembered, even if my son had chosen to forget. "Eleanor," Aunt Margaret rushed over, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Honey, we looked for you at the ceremony. Where were you sitting?" "Outside," I said simply, loud enough for nearby conversations to pause. "With the catering staff." The silence spread like ripples on water. My son's head turned, his eyes meeting mine across the crowded room. I saw recognition there, and something else. Panic. He excused himself from his circle of admirers and walked over, his smile bright and artificial. "Mom, there you are. I was looking for you earlier." "Were you?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly in the setting quiet. Because I was easy to find, I was in the folding chair outside the ceremony, watching through the doorway. His face flushed. "There was some confusion with the seating arrangements." "No confusion," I interrupted, pulling my notebook from my purse. The leather binding caught the light like a talisman. "Everything was exactly as planned." More guests had turned to watch now. The bride appeared at my son's elbow, her smile strained. "Mrs. Patterson, how lovely that you could make it." "It's Eleanor." And yes, it was quite a journey. 3,000 miles I flew to be here, just like I traveled to every game, every recital, every milestone for 27 years. My son's jaw tightened. "Mom, maybe we should talk about this privately." "Privately?" I opened my notebook, my fingers finding the pages I'd written in careful detail. "Like we talked privately when you decided a nursing home would be a good solution for me. Like we talked privately about your inheritance assumptions. Like we talked privately about anything that mattered to your mother." The reception had gone completely quiet now. Even the string quartet had stopped playing. All eyes were on us, the successful son and the mother he'd forgotten. I looked around the room at faces I recognized, people who'd watched me sacrifice everything for the boy who was now squirming under their collective gaze. When I spoke again, my voice was calm, clear, and unwavering. "I want to tell you all a story about a 20-year-old single mother who worked double shifts at Murphy's Diner while taking night classes to better herself, who sewed Halloween costumes by hand because she couldn't afford store-bought ones, who gave up every dream she'd ever had so that her son could achieve his." I could see my son's face growing paler with each word, but I continued. "I want to tell you about a woman who emptied her savings account to pay for law school, who worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, who gave her son his grandmother's inheritance early because she trusted in love and gratitude." Aunt Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Cousin Robert shook his head in disbelief. They were remembering now, all of them, the woman I used to be before I became invisible. "And I want to tell you about a son," I said, my eyes locked on his, "who became so successful, so important, that he forgot where he came from, who assigns his mother a folding chair outside his wedding while strangers sit in places of honor." The silence was deafening. My son opened his mouth, but no words came. His bride touched his arm, her face a mask of mortification. I reached up and slowly untied my periwinkle scarf, the faithful companion of every proud moment we'd shared. I folded it carefully, precisely, and placed it on the gift table among the crystal and silver. "This scarf has been to every celebration of your life, your graduation, your first job, every achievement you've earned. But it won't be attending anymore, because a mother's love isn't meant to be hidden outside in folding chairs. It's meant to be honored, cherished, and remembered." I turned to leave,
my notebook clutched firmly in my hand, my spine straight and unbending. Behind me, I could hear whispers beginning, conversation starting, the slow burn of realization spreading through the room like wildfire. At the door, I paused and looked back one last time. My son stood frozen by the gift table, my scarf in his hands, finally understanding what he'd lost. The storm had passed, but the reckoning was just beginning.
3 weeks had passed since the reception, and my phone had been ringing constantly. Not from my son. Those calls had stopped after the first desperate few, but from everyone else. Aunt Margaret, Cousin Robert, Mrs. Henderson, old friends I hadn't heard from in years, all calling to check on me, to apologize for not speaking up, to share their own stories of watching their children drift away. The whispers had spread far beyond that glittering reception hall. I sat in my kitchen back home, morning light streaming through windows that faced my garden, and opened my laptop. The legal documents I'd requested were spread across the table like battle plans. My will, revised and notarized, power of attorney forms, updated, financial accounts, reorganized. The beach house deed, which had always been in my name alone, now protected by an ironclad trust. My son had assumed so much, assumed I was helpless, assumed I was dependent, assumed he controlled my legacy because he controlled my loneliness. He was wrong on all counts. The doorbell rang, and I knew who it would be before I opened it. My son stood on my porch, looking haggard and desperate, still handsome but diminished somehow. Success, I'd learned, was a fragile thing when built on the foundation of someone else's sacrifice. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking like it had when he was 12 and caught lying about his homework. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I asked, not moving from the doorway. "Because we've had 27 years to talk, and you seem to manage just fine without my input." He pushed past me into the house, moving through rooms that had once been his sanctuary. Everything was exactly as he'd left it when he moved away. His high school trophies still on the mantle, his college graduation photo still on the piano, a shrine to a love that had been taken for granted. "I've been getting calls," he said, turning to face me in the living room where I'd once helped him with algebra and listened to his teenage heartbreaks. They're saying things." "What kinds of things?" "About the wedding, about how you treated me." His face flushed with anger, not at himself, but at me. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone I know." I walked to my chair by the window, the same chair where I'd sat thousands of evenings waiting for him to call, to visit, to remember I existed. I picked up my revised will from the side table, its pages crisp and final. "I told the truth," I said simply. "If the truth embarrassed you, perhaps you should examine why." He saw the documents in my hands, and something shifted in his expression. Fear, maybe, or calculation. "What are those?" I said, "Insurance, against ever being seated outside my own life again." I watched him process what that meant. The beach house he'd planned to inherit, the retirement accounts he'd counted on, the financial security he assumed would transfer to him simply because he existed. "You can't be serious," he said, reaching for the papers. I held them away from him, this boy I'd raised to be a man who forgot how to be a son. "I'm more serious than I've ever been in my life." "You're my son." "Yes," I said, my voice steady as stone. "And for 27 years, that meant everything to me. But love isn't a one-way street, and neither is family." He began to pace, his lawyer's mind working through possibilities and consequences. "People are talking about this all over town. Business associates, friends, everyone. Do you know what this is doing to my reputation?" "Your reputation," I repeated slowly. "Tell me, what's my reputation worth? The woman who raised you alone, who sacrificed everything for your success, who was relegated to a folding chair at your wedding? What's her reputation worth in your calculations? The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Outside my window, the roses were beginning to bloom, early buds pushing through thorns towards sunlight. They knew something about surviving harsh seasons that my son had never learned. He said, "I can change. I can do better." "Can you?" I asked. "Or are you just afraid of losing your inheritance?" The question hung in the air like smoke. We both knew the answer. He left without another word, and I watched from my window as he drove away, probably to call lawyers and financial advisors and anyone who might help him undo what couldn't be undone. The trust was irrevocable, the will was binding. The woman who had spent decades being taken for granted had finally taken herself seriously. I folded the documents carefully and placed them in my desk drawer. Then I made myself a cup of tea, Earl Grey, my favorite, the kind I had given up drinking because he didn't like the smell, and sat in my garden to watch my roses grow. The seeds I had planted were beginning to bloom, and with them, a new season of my life was finally beginning.
6 months later, my garden had become a masterpiece. The roses I'd planted after the wedding bloomed in defiant splendor, deep reds and soft pinks, climbing varieties that reached toward the sky with thorny determination, bush roses that spread wide and claimed their space with unapologetic beauty. I knelt among them in the early morning light, my hands dark with earth, my heart lighter than it had been in years. Each bloom was a small victory, each thorn a reminder that beauty and strength often grew from the same stem. My phone rarely rang with desperation anymore. The lawyers had given up trying to find loopholes in documents drawn up by a woman who'd spent decades learning that the fine print mattered. My son's calls had dwindled to awkward holiday check-ins, conversations that felt more like business transactions than family bonds. But other calls had taken their place. Women from my book club who'd found their own courage to demand better treatment from ungrateful children. Old friends who'd watched my transformation and decided to write their own new chapters. Aunt Margaret, who'd started setting boundaries with her own family. Mrs. Henderson, who'd moved into a retirement community not because she was forced to, but because she chose to. I had become something I'd never intended to be, an inspiration. The notebook that had started as a weapon had evolved into something else entirely. I still wrote in it every morning, but now the pages were filled with plans for the future rather than accounting for the past. Garden designs, travel itineraries, investment strategies. The dreams I'd deferred for decades were finally getting their turn. The beach house in Delaware had become my retreat, a place where I spent long weekends reading by the ocean and remembering who I used to be before motherhood consumed my identity. I'd started inviting friends, women like me who'd rediscovered themselves in the second acts of their lives. This morning, as I pruned the climbing roses along my back fence, I found a letter tucked under my garden gate. My name was written in handwriting I recognized. Careful, precise, the penmanship I'd taught him when he was 7 years old. I didn't open it immediately. Instead, I finished my work among the roses, watering them with the careful attention they deserved, deadheading spent blooms to make room for new growth. When the garden was tended, I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey and sat in my favorite chair by the window. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on good stationery. It began with apologies and moved through explanations, but what struck me most was what it didn't contain. No demands, no ultimatums, no calculations about inheritance or expectations about forgiveness. Just the words of a man who'd finally understood what he'd lost. He wrote about the whispers that followed him now, how people looked at him differently since the reception, how his wife had struggled with the judgment of her friends, how their marriage had been strained by the weight of his choices. He wrote about therapy sessions and hard truths and the slow, painful process of seeing himself clearly for the first time. But mostly, he wrote about remembering. The Superman costume, the bicycle,
the college fund built from diner tips and overtime hours, the woman who'd loved him so completely that she'd forgotten to save any love for herself. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside, then picked up my notebook, my faithful companion in this journey towards self-respect. I turned to a fresh page and began to write not a response to his letter, but a new entry for myself. Today, I am 72 years old, I wrote. I have roses blooming in 6 colors, a bank account that belongs entirely to me, and friends who call me by name instead of taking me for granted. I have a son who is finally learning the cost of his choices, and the wisdom to know that his education is not my responsibility to provide. I paused, my pen hovering over paper, watching through my window as a cardinal landed among my rose bushes. Bright red and fearless, it perched on a thorny branch without flinching, secure in its own ability to navigate the sharp edges of beauty. I have learned that love without respect is not love at all, but servitude. I have learned that sacrifice without gratitude is not noble, but foolish. And I have learned that it is never too late to bloom exactly where you plant yourself. The cardinal flew away, a flash of scarlet against the green of my garden, and I closed my notebook with a sense of completion. Not the end of my story, but the end of the chapter where I lived for everyone but myself. I stood and walked to my kitchen, where I began preparing dinner for one, a meal that I would season to my own taste, eat at my own pace, and enjoy in my own company. Later, I would call Aunt Margaret and plan our next adventure. Maybe we'd drive to the mountains or book that cruise we'd been talking about, or simply sit in my garden and toast to the roses that proved beauty could bloom at any age. The sun was setting as I stepped outside one last time to lock my garden gate. My roses glowed in the golden light, their petals soft as silk, but their stems strong as steel. They had taught me something precious, that the most beautiful things in life were often the ones that knew how to protect themselves. I touched one perfect bloom gently, breathing in its fragrance, and whispered the words I'd been waiting 72 years to say. This is my garden. This is my life. This is my time to bloom. And with that, I walked back into my house, not as the woman who'd been discarded at a wedding, but as the woman who'd learned to plant her own roses and tend her own dreams and write her own ending. The notebook lay closed on my table, its pages full of the story of a woman who'd finally remembered her own worth. Tomorrow, I would begin a new page, because the best stories never really end. They just bloom into something more beautiful than anyone ever imagined possible.